The air in our living room was thick, not with the heat of an argument, but with the ice-cold weight of a betrayal I never saw coming. Daniel didn't even look up from his laptop. With a careless shrug that dismissed 10 years of my life, he uttered the words that changed everything. "I'm done pretending I like your family, Allison. Don't ever invite me to dinner again." In that moment, the man I was supposed to marry became a stranger. He expected tears. He expected a plea for him to reconsider. Instead, I felt a chilling clarity. I didn't argue. I didn't scream. I simply nodded and walked out, leaving him to bask in his supposed victory. He thought he had just set a boundary. He didn't realize he had just handed me the keys to his own destruction. That night, at my father's 60th birthday, the seat next to me wasn't empty. I arrived with a guest who didn't just command the room, he commanded the very industry Daniel was desperate to conquer. When the family photos hit social media an hour later, Daniel's world began to fracture. His phone didn't just buzz. It screamed with the realization that he was no longer the protagonist of my story. You are about to witness a masterclass in silent clinical revenge. This isn't just a story about a breakup. It's about what happens when a man mistakes a woman's composure for weakness. Stay with me until the very end, because the twist in the final minutes involving a professional audit and a secret Daniel thought he'd buried will deliver a level of satisfaction you won't see coming. Daniel wanted to stop pretending. Fine. Let's show him what reality looks like. My name is Allison, and at 54, I have spent the better part of 2 decades navigating the high-stakes sterile corridors of city hospitals as a senior healthcare administrator. My career has been defined by my ability to remain the eye of the storm, managing chaotic emergency rooms and complex surgical schedules with a steady hand and a mind that prioritizes logic over panic. I thought I had mastered the art of reading people, of identifying a crisis before it reached a breaking point, but I was about to learn that the most dangerous pathology was the one thriving right across from me at my own dinner table. The evening seemed entirely unremarkable, the kind of Tuesday that usually blends into the background of a long marriage. The sun was dipping below the horizon, casting a warm, deceptive amber glow over our polished mahogany dining table. There were no raised voices, no slammed doors, and certainly no hint of the storm that was about to break. Daniel sat across from me, his silver-rimmed glasses perched on the bridge of his nose as he meticulously cut through a piece of roasted chicken. He looked exactly like the man I had loved for 15 years, successful, composed, and intellectually sharp. But when he finally looked up, his eyes weren't filled with the warmth of a partner. They held the clinical detachment of a man delivering a final verdict. "I'm done pretending I like your family, Allison," he said. His voice was steady, devoid of the jagged edges of anger. It was the tone he used when reviewing a disappointing quarterly report. "They're loud, their stories are tedious, and quite frankly, they add nothing to my life. From now on, don't ever invite me to dinner with them again. Consider my presence at your family functions a thing of the past." For a moment, the air seemed to vanish from the room. A younger version of myself might have gasped, or perhaps launched into a passionate defense of my parents and siblings. I might have reminded him of the time my father helped him secure his first bridge loan, or how my sister stayed up with us when his own mother passed away. But as a healthcare administrator, I have been trained to handle code blues, those moments where a patient's heart stops and every second counts. In those moments, you don't scream at the monitor for failing. You observe the symptoms, you analyze the vitals, and you prepare a response. I watched him closely. I saw the slight, arrogant tilt of his chin and the way his shoulders relaxed after he spoke. He wasn't tired, and he wasn't having a bad day. This was an assertion of power. He was testing the fence, looking for the weak spot in my resolve. By unilaterally deciding to erase my family from our shared life, he was attempting to redefine the very boundaries of my world. He expected a fight because a fight would have given him the opportunity to play the victim, to label me as emotional or unreasonable. When I met his gaze with a calm, unblinking silence, I saw a flicker of confusion cross his face, followed quickly by a smug sense of relief. He thought my silence was submission. He thought he had won. As I sat there, my mind began to do what it does best. It began to audit. I didn't see just one evening. I saw a decade of data points suddenly aligning into a terrifyingly clear pattern. I remembered the falling out he had with his best man 3 years ago, a man he claimed had become disrespectful, but who I now realized had simply stopped agreeing with Daniel's every opinion. I thought of the brilliant young analyst Daniel had fired last spring, citing poor cultural fit, when the truth was that the boy had dared to correct one of Daniel's spreadsheets in front of the board. The systematic nature of his disdain began to unveil itself. It wasn't just my family, it was anyone who possessed an independent spark, anyone who didn't serve as a polished mirror for his own ego. To Daniel, people were not individuals to be loved or respected. They were assets to be managed or liabilities to be liquidated. My family, with their deep roots, their inside jokes, and their unwavering loyalty to me, represented a territory he couldn't fully conquer. By cutting them off, he wasn't just avoiding a tedious dinner. He was attempting to isolate me, to strip away my support system until he was the only authority left in my life. I watched him return to his meal, his movements fluid and relaxed, convinced that he had successfully managed a difficult staffing issue in our marriage. He had no idea that I was no longer seeing him as my fiancé, but as a crisis that needed to be contained. My silence wasn't a white flag. It was the quiet before a surgical strike. I was documenting the coldness in his eyes and the calculated cruelty of his words, filing them away for the day I would present the final bill. He believed he was simplifying his life by removing the clutter of my relatives, but he was actually beginning the process of his own erasure. I looked at the man who had shared my bed and my dreams, and for the first time I saw the hollowness behind the sophisticated mask. The normal tyranny he had practiced for years, the subtle belittling of my hobbies, the quiet sighs when I talked about my work, had finally coalesced into this blatant ultimatum. He was no longer pretending, and in a way it was the greatest gift he could have given me. The mask had slipped, and underneath was a man who believed he had the right to curate my soul. That was when I realized he wasn't drawing a boundary, he was testing how much of my life he could erase. The silence that followed Daniel's ultimatum was not the empty kind. It was heavy and fertile like the air before a lightning strike. I spent the next 3 days moving through our shared home with a ghost-like efficiency, maintaining my composure while my mind ran a diagnostic on every interaction we had ever had. Daniel, convinced that his decree had successfully cowed me into submission, was uncharacteristically pleasant whistling tunes while he brewed his morning coffee, seemingly oblivious to the fact that he had essentially declared war on my identity. When Friday evening arrived, the night of my father's 60th birthday dinner, Daniel was already draped across the sofa in his silk loungewear, his laptop open, his expression one of smug relaxation. He didn't even look up as I walked into the living room dressed in a sharp emerald silk wrap dress and my grandmother's pearls. He likely expected me to mope in the bedroom or offer a final desperate plea for his company, but I simply grabbed my clutch and headed for the door. I didn't announce my departure, and I didn't ask him one last time to join me. The time for asking had ended the moment he decided my lineage was a burden he no longer wished to carry. I arrived at the restaurant, a warm, family-owned Italian bistro that had been a staple of our celebrations for decades, and felt a sudden sharp pang of relief as the scent of garlic and rosemary enveloped me. My family was already there, a boisterous, loving cluster of people who shared my eyes and my laugh. When my sister Sarah looked up and saw me standing alone, her smile faltered for a fraction of a second. She scanned the space behind me, looking for the familiar tall silhouette of the man I was supposed to marry. When I reached the table, the question was inevitable, posed by my father with a gentle concern in his voice. He asked where Daniel was, his eyes searching mine for a sign of trouble. In the past, I would have manufactured a high-stakes work crisis or a sudden debilitating migraine to protect Daniel's reputation. I would have lied to keep the piece smoothing over his jagged edges so my family wouldn't see the coldness beneath. But tonight, I chose the power of the unvarnished truth. I sat down, tucked my napkin into my lap, and said quite simply that Daniel had other priorities and wouldn't be joining us tonight, or for any future family dinners. I didn't deliver it with bitterness or a shaky voice. I said it with the same professional neutrality I used to announce a budget shortfall to the hospital board. The table went quiet for a beat, a collective realization rippling through them, but because I hadn't made it a tragedy, they didn't treat it as one. They saw my strength and they respected it, allowing the evening to proceed without the suffocating weight of Daniel's feigned interest. The evening took an unexpected turn when Mark arrived. I had invited him earlier that week, not as a date, but as a colleague whose expertise I genuinely valued. Mark was a senior board consultant for several major healthcare networks, a man whose reputation for integrity was as legendary as his sharp analytical mind. We had worked together on a grueling restructuring project over the summer, and I knew he was in town for a conference. When he walked toward our table, he didn't carry the practiced performative charm that Daniel used to mask his boredom. Mark greeted my father with a genuine handshake, listened with rapt attention as my nephew described his latest soccer goal, and laughed heartily at my mother's eccentric stories about her gardening club. He didn't flirt with me or try to occupy the spotlight. He simply existed in the space with a quiet, natural dignity that made Daniel's previous endurance of my family look like the childish theater it was. Seeing Mark engage with the people I loved without the need for an audience or an ulterior motive served as a powerful contrast. It proved that my family wasn't a burden to be tolerated, but a community to be enjoyed. Mark's presence wasn't a weapon I was using against Daniel, but a mirror reflecting what a real partner, a real man of substance looked like. The most delicious irony of the night, however, came from a source I never could have planned. Daniel's mother, Evelyn, had always been closer to me than to her own son, often lamenting his emotional distance. She had joined us for the dinner as she often did, and she had spent the evening watching Mark with an approving, observant eye. Toward the end of the meal, as the cake was being served and the laughter reached its peak, Evelyn took out her phone. She snapped a candid photo of the table, a beautiful shot of my father laughing with Mark, leaning in to hear a story, and me looking on with a genuine, relaxed smile I hadn't worn in years. Evelyn, who possessed a surprisingly large social media following among the local elite, posted the photo almost instantly. Her caption was simple but devastating. A truly wonderful evening celebrating a great man. So refreshing to be surrounded by such warmth and genuine company. Within minutes, I saw the notification on my own phone, but I also knew exactly what was happening 20 miles away in our living room. Daniel, who obsessed over his digital footprint, and his mother's approval would see that photo. He wouldn't see a betrayal in the romantic sense. He would see a far more painful loss of status. He would see a man who surpassed him in every professional and social metric, comfortably occupying the seat he had so arrogantly vacated. He would see that the world didn't stop turning when he stepped away. It actually got brighter. His phone began to buzz incessantly with messages from mutual friends asking who the distinguished guest was, and I knew the smug relaxation he felt earlier that evening was being replaced by a cold, prickling sense of irrelevance. I hadn't brought someone new to make a point. The point made itself. The drive home from my father's dinner was bathed in a silence that felt remarkably different from the suffocating tension of the past few days. It was the quiet of a strategist returning from a successful reconnaissance mission. When I walked through the front door, the atmosphere in the foyer was charged with an electric, jagged energy. Daniel was not in bed. He was standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows of our penthouse, the blue light from his smartphone illuminating his face like a mask of cold fury. He didn't wait for me to take off my coat before he launched his offensive. His voice was a low, dangerous hiss, vibrating with the classic language of control I had seen him use on junior associates for years. He told me I was acting different, that my behavior lately was unrecognizable and deeply disrespectful to the life we had built together. He began to weave a narrative where I was the erratic one, questioning my judgment for bringing a stranger like Mark into a private family setting. It was a textbook display of gaslighting, an attempt to make me doubt my own reality by framing my independence as a betrayal of our unspoken contract. As a healthcare administrator, I had spent decades listening to the manipulative jargon of insurance adjusters and hospital politicians, and hearing it now in my own living room was like watching a poorly rehearsed play. I realized his anger had nothing to do with jealousy in the traditional sense. He wasn't worried that I was falling for Mark. He was terrified because he had lost his grip on the narrative of who I was. He was losing control over my schedule, my social circle, and most importantly, the image of the dutiful, isolated wife he had spent 15 years perfecting. As he paced the length of the Persian rug, listing my perceived transgressions with clinical precision, a profound and chilling revelation settled over me. I watched the way his hands shook slightly, not with heartbreak, but with the raw frustration of a master who had found his favorite tool suddenly blunt and unresponsive. I realized in that moment that Daniel was only ever truly comfortable, only ever loving, when I occupied a lower rung on the ladder of our relationship. He thrived when I was the one explaining my whereabouts, when I was the one asking for his permission to change the drapes, or when I was the one constantly seeking his validation for my professional achievements. To Daniel, love was not a partnership of equals. It was a hierarchy of dominance. He didn't see me as a woman with an inner life. He saw me as an extension of his own status, a decorative asset that was supposed to remain static and predictable. Now that I was moving through the world with a sense of purpose that didn't involve him, I had become a glitch in his system. He viewed my growth as a personal threat because it meant I no longer needed his light to see my own path. The realization was as simple as it was devastating. He had never actually loved the real me. He had only ever loved the version of me that functioned as a pedestal for his superior ego. A younger, more impulsive woman might have packed a bag right then and there, fueled by the righteous fire of that discovery. But I was 54 years old, and I had learned that the most effective surgeries are the ones where you wait for the swelling to go down before you make the first cut. I decided on a strategic retreat. Instead of escalating the argument or giving him the satisfaction of a dramatic exit, I simply looked at him with a calm, vacant expression that gave him nothing to latch onto. I told him I was tired and that we could discuss his concerns when he was less emotional. I chose to stay in the guest room not as a victim hiding, but as a scientist remaining in the laboratory to witness the final inevitable stages of a failing experiment. I needed to see the full extent of his character when he was backed into a corner to gather every shred of evidence before I finalized the audit of our marriage. I wanted to be 100% certain that when I finally walked away, there would be no lingering doubts, no what-ifs, and no room for him to ever manipulate his way back into my life. I watched him through the cracked door as he poured himself a stiff drink, his eyes fixed on the social media post his mother had made his thumb obsessively scrolling through the comments. He wasn't mourning the distance between us. He didn't miss me. He missed the woman who made him feel important. The days following my move to the guest room felt like the quiet calibration of a precision instrument. I began what I called my silent audit, a process of stripping away the protective layer of lies I had spent years weaving around Daniel's reputation. For over a decade, I had been his unofficial public relations manager, smoothing over his sharp edges at cocktail parties and translating his coldness into tiredness or professional focus for our mutual friends. But as I moved through the social circuits of our city that week, I simply stopped. When our old friends the Millers asked why Daniel had missed the symphony opening, I didn't fabricate a late-night conference call or a looming deadline. I looked them in the eye and said calmly that he simply hadn't felt like coming because he found the crowd tedious. There was no malice in my tone, only a terrifying clinical honesty. I watched the realization dawn on their faces as they processed the unvarnished truth of the man they had invited into their inner circle. Without my constant polishing, Daniel's character began to oxidize in the open air, revealing the rusted, jagged ego beneath. It was a passive form of revenge, yet it was devastatingly effective. By refusing to be his shield, I forced him to stand alone against the social judgment he had long avoided. I realized then that I didn't have to burn his world down. I just had to stop holding the umbrella while he poured the gasoline. The true test of my resolve came on Thursday morning during a high-stakes board meeting for the Metropolitan Healthcare Expansion Project. As a senior administrator, I was responsible for presenting the operational logistics of the new Regional Trauma Center, a multi-million-dollar initiative that Daniel had been aggressively lobbying to join as the lead legal counsel. He walked into the wood-paneled boardroom with his usual air of unearned confidence, adjusted his expensive silk tie, and took a seat at the far end of the table, oblivious to the fact that his world was about to collide with mine in a way he couldn't control. He saw Mark sitting next to the board chairman, but dismissed him with a barely perceptible nod, clearly assuming Mark was nothing more than the family friend he had seen in his mother's social media post. Daniel's arrogance was so profound that it never occurred to him to check Mark's professional credentials before entering the room. He assumed that because he had decided my family was beneath him, anyone associated with them must also be a lightweight in the professional arena. He was so busy trying to look like the most important man in the room that he failed to notice the man who actually held the power. As I began my presentation outlining the critical need for community-based outpatient services, Daniel chose to make his move. He interrupted me with a patronizing chuckle, a sound that had once made me shrink but now only made me observe him with detached curiosity. He turned to the board, dismissing my data with a wave of his hand, and began a condescending lecture on why we should prioritize high-end private suites over community access. He looked directly at me and said that my sentimental attachment to the local demographic was clouded by emotional baggage and family distractions that had no place in a serious fiscal strategy. He used the exact same phrasing he had used on that Tuesday night at our dinner table, projecting his domestic disdain onto a professional stage. The room went cold. I remained perfectly still, my expression neutral, watching as Daniel dug a hole so deep he wouldn't be able to see the sky. I didn't defend myself and I didn't push back. I simply waited, knowing that in a room full of healthcare professionals, his lack of empathy wasn't just a personality flaw. It was a massive liability for a project built on public trust and community welfare. Mark, who had been silently taking notes, finally looked up. His gaze was like a sheet of ice. He didn't raise his voice, but the authority in his tone cut through Daniel's rambling like a scalpel. Mark identified himself not just as a consultant, but as the lead oversight director for the entire expansion project, the man whose final signature Daniel needed to secure his contract. Mark asked Daniel to repeat his comments about family distractions and sentimental baggage, noting that a person who views the core values of the community as an emotional weakness is fundamentally incapable of representing a healthcare institution. Daniel's face transitioned from a smug pink to a ghostly mottled gray as the weight of his mistake crashed down on him. He looked at me, his eyes pleading for me to step in to offer one of my signature saves to translate his cruelty into something palatable for the board. But I just sat there, my hands folded neatly on my tablet, a silent spectator to his self-destruction. Mark's clinical coldness matched my own, and together we conducted a moral audit that Daniel couldn't survive. He had walked into that room expecting to assert dominance over me, but he left having documented his own professional obsolescence. He had spent years believing I was the one who needed him, never realizing that I was the only thing standing between him and the consequences of his own character. I didn't have to expose his true nature to the world. I just had to step aside and let them see him clearly. I didn't expose him. I just stopped standing in front of him. The following week felt like the slow, deliberate climb of a roller coaster reaching its peak, that breathless moment of suspension before the inevitable plunge. The prestigious City Healthcare Gala was always the social and professional highlight of our year, a glittering assembly of the region's most influential philanthropists, civic leaders, and medical pioneers. In years past, I would have spent weeks meticulously prepping Daniel, briefing him on the guest list, and ensuring he knew exactly which hands to shake and which topics to avoid. I had been his social compass, navigating him away from his own arrogance, so he could maintain the illusion of being a community-minded leader. But as I stood in our bedroom getting ready that evening, the mirror reflected a woman who was done with the theater of protection. I chose a dress of midnight navy velvet, understated and commanding, and I didn't ask Daniel if he liked it. I didn't wait for him to finish his drink, and I didn't offer the usual encouraging words about the speech he might be asked to give. We arrived together, but for the first time in 15 years, we were not a unit. We were two separate entities moving through the same space. The air between us was brittle, and I could tell Daniel was beginning to feel the edges of his world fraying, though his pride still blinded him to the depth of the chasm opening beneath his feet. The grand ballroom was a sea of tuxedos and silk. the hum of polite conversation punctuated by the clinking of crystal. As the evening progressed, it became increasingly clear that my silent audit was yielding results. People who used to greet Daniel with warmth now offered stiff formal nods before turning to me with genuine enthusiasm. They had seen him without my filter, and they didn't like what they saw. Daniel's frustration was palpable, a low-frequency vibration of resentment that he tried to mask with forced laughter. The climax of the night arrived when the city's mayor, a woman who had built her career on grassroots advocacy, took the stage to lead a panel discussion on the future of community values in private sectors. Daniel, ever the seeker of the spotlight, was invited to speak as a representative of the legal and corporate side of the expansion project. He took the microphone with a flourish, his ego bolstered by the high-profile platform. He started well enough, but as the mayor pressed him on how his firm would prioritize the needs of marginalized families in the new trauma center, Daniel's mask began to slip. He was tired of being questioned, tired of Allison's rising social stock, and tired of pretending to care about a demographic he secretly loathed. Under the pressure of the spotlight and his own spiraling insecurity, his true colors finally bled through the expensive suit. He leaned into the microphone, his voice dripping with a condescending edge that silenced the room. He spoke of fiscal realities and efficiency models, but then he went a step too far. He chuckled that same patronizing laugh I had heard at our dinner table and said that while community outreach sounded nice in a brochure, at some point, a business has to stop catering to social obligations to people who simply don't matter in the larger economic landscape. He dismissed the very families the mayor had spent 30 years protecting as burdensome distractions to a profitable bottom line. The effect was instantaneous and chilling. The room, which moments ago had been filled with the murmurs of 500 people, went absolutely terrifyingly silent. It wasn't just a quiet room. It was the sound of an entire community collectively withdrawing its respect. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of doors being locked and bridges being burned in real time. Daniel, sensing the shift, but too arrogant to pivot, looked around the room, his eyes frantically searching for me. For 15 years, he had been used to me catching his eye from across a room, giving him the subtle signal to stop or stepping in with a clever joke to soften his blow. He looked for the woman who would save him from himself, the woman who would mend the social fabric he had just shredded. But for the first time, I wasn't there for him. I was standing on the far side of the ballroom, framed by a circle of the city's most respected board members and Mark, who was listening to me with an expression of profound professional regard. I didn't look toward the stage. I didn't flinch. I continued my conversation, laughing softly at a point Mark had made, my back turned to the man who was currently drowning in his own hubris. I chose to ignore him entirely, leaving him to stand in the middle of that devastating silence alone. I saw him realize in a flash of pure, unadulterated panic that the shield was gone. He was no longer the brilliant legal mind or the respected provider. He was just a small, cruel man who had insulted everyone in the room. I didn't wait for the panel to end, and I didn't wait for the inevitable awkward attempts at damage control he would surely try. I felt a sense of peace that was almost crystalline in its clarity. I moved toward the coat check with a measured, dignified grace, greeting colleagues with a warm smile as I passed. I didn't make a scene, and I didn't utter a single word of reproach. My departure was my statement. As I stepped out into the cool night air, leaving the stifling atmosphere of the ballroom behind, I felt lighter than I had in decades. The power dynamic hadn't just shifted, it had been dismantled. Back in the ballroom, Daniel was left standing on that stage, the microphone still in his hand, facing the cold, unblinking judgment of his peers. He looked like a man who had suddenly realized he was standing on a trapdoor. He had spent years believing he was the sun, and I was merely a moon reflecting his light, never understanding that I was the one who had been holding the sky up for him. As the doors closed behind me, I knew that his social and professional execution was complete, and he had pulled the lever himself. That was the first time he realized no one was coming to save him. The cool night air outside the gala was the first breath of freedom I had taken in 15 years, a sharp contrast to the suffocating atmosphere of the ballroom, where Daniel's reputation was still actively disintegrating. When I arrived back at our penthouse, I didn't pace the floors or wait up with a glass of wine to hear his excuses. I went straight to the guest room, heart rate steady, and slept with a profound sense of closure. It was nearly 3 in the morning when I heard the front door click and the heavy, uneven footsteps of a man who had finally realized the world was not his footstool. A few moments later, a soft, tentative knock sounded on my door. Daniel stood in the hallway, his tuxedo jacket discarded and his eyes rimmed with red. He began a rambling, desperate monologue about how he had been under immense pressure, how the mayor had baited him, and how he didn't mean it that way. It was a performance of remorse so hollow I could practically hear the echo. As I watched him, I realized he wasn't crying because he had hurt me or insulted the community. He was crying because the board had sent him an email rescinding his contract offer before he had even reached the parking lot. He was sorry that he was now a pariah, not that he was a predator. I waited for him to finish for the last of his frantic justifications to die out in the quiet hallway. I looked him in the eye and used the very words he had used to shatter my world just weeks ago. I told him that I was done pretending his apologies had any value, and that I was done pretending our life together was anything more than a carefully managed illusion. The look of pure shock on his face was the final data point I needed. He had expected me to be the one person who would always be obligated to forgive him, but he had forgotten that obligations die when respect is systematically murdered. In the weeks that followed our final separation, I discovered that there is a vast, beautiful difference between being alone and being free. I moved into a sun-drenched townhome closer to my sister and my parents, a space filled with colors Daniel would have called distracting, and books he would have deemed unnecessary. My weekends were no longer spent navigating his moods or shielding my family from his arrogance. Instead, they were filled with the chaotic, joyful noise of Sunday brunches and the quiet satisfaction of rebuilding my own life on my own terms. I didn't rush to fill the silence Daniel left behind with another man. While Mark and I continued to work together, our relationship remained anchored in a deep professional respect and a blossoming friendship that didn't require labels or haste. We shared long dinners where the conversation flowed effortlessly, not because we were dating, but because we were two adults who truly enjoyed the substance of one another's minds. There was a maybe in the air between us, a gentle possibility for the future, but I was no longer a woman who needed a man to validate her existence. My peace came from a source much deeper than romantic approval. It came from the fact that I no longer had to shrink my intellect, my family, or my spirit to keep the peace in my own home. I had stopped performing for an audience of one, and in doing so, I had found my voice again. Daniel's decline was a quiet, inevitable affair. Without the social scaffolding I had provided, his firm's client list began to dwindle as word of his gala outburst spread through the city's close-knit professional circles. He became a cautionary tale, a man whose brilliance was eclipsed by his own toxicity. I didn't feel the need to check his social media or ask mutual friends about his well-being. He had become irrelevant, a ghost from a past life that no longer had any claim on my present. This was the final wisdom I gathered from the wreckage of our years together. The way a person treats your family, your roots, and the people who have no power over them is the ultimate preview of how they will treat you once your utility to them expires. A man who sees your loved ones as a burden will eventually see you as one too. I realized that my revenge was never about a grand cinematic gesture of destruction. I didn't need to ruin him. His character was already doing that for him. My revenge was simply the withdrawal of my presence. I took back the energy I had spent protecting him, the intelligence I had used to guide him, and the love I had wasted on a mask. I left him with exactly what he had asked for a life without the distraction of my family and the burden of my emotional baggage. I left him with the vacuum of his own ego, and it turned out to be the coldest punishment imaginable. As I sit on my new terrace tonight, watching the city lights twinkle in the distance, I realize that I am not just a survivor of a narcissistic man, but the architect of my own second act. The quiet around me is no longer the heavy, cautious silence of walking on eggshells. It is the light, airy quiet of a woman who is at peace with herself. I think back to that Tuesday night and the cold shrug Daniel gave as he tried to erase my history. He thought he was taking something away from me, but he was actually giving me the world back. I didn't need to find someone new to prove my worth, because I had finally found the person I had been neglecting for 15 years myself. The journey from that dinner table to this terrace was long and fraught with painful realizations, but every step was worth the clarity I feel now. I am 54, and for the first time in my life, I am not living for someone else's approval or shielding someone else's failures. I am standing in the sun, surrounded by the people who truly love me and moving toward a future that I defined. I didn't replace him with another man or a new set of distractions. I didn't replace him. I replaced the silence I used to live with. I hope the journey of Allison has resonated with you today. If you found her strength and her silent audit as empowering as I did, please consider subscribing to our channel and hitting the notification bell so you never miss another story of resilience and justice. We truly value this community and want to hear from you. Have you ever experienced a moment where someone tried to isolate you from your family, or have you witnessed a mask slip like Daniel's in your own professional life? Your stories and insights are what make this channel special, so please share your thoughts in the comments below. We read every one of them to understand what matters most to you. Thank you for watching, for your continued support, and for being part of this incredible journey toward truth and empowerment.